but like the same group of people who want to protest the wars in, Ukraine are all for, hey, let's go fight a war with Iran and China. I'm like, you guys are nuts. Like, we don't want to do that. We should be trading with these people.
One of the trigger for the Tiananmen Square protest in 1989 was the runaway inflation, because when China started market reform, there was two pricing systems. One system was set by the state for all the state-owned enterprises, how much things should cost, how much things they should sell for. And the other system is the market price, So what happened is a lot of people who have the connection, who can, like, say, get material from a state-owned enterprise at the state set artificially deflated price, and then turn around and sell them on open market, you can make a killing. So there was a lot of corruption. And when they try to lift the price control, it kind of trigger high inflation, and a lot of the urban residents start getting left behind, like people who are getting paid salaries, like school teachers, professors, doctors, and so there was a widespread protest in 1989, originally to protest the corruption and protest the high inflation, and by eventually that turned into a political movement that led to the final crackdown, like 2 months later. It was crazy time, because to tell you just how much big difference happened in early 80s to late 80s. In the early 80s, like my sister is 4 years older than me, and so I would use some of her like unused school notebook when I went to school. I saw one of her old unused notebook from 1979, right? And on the back, still full of political slogans like, be vigilant against the evil Soviet social imperialism. Mm-hmm. Like, so when I saw that in mid-1980s, I already felt like, wow, that language is kind of strident, like, is that necessary? but like, at that time, when I first grew up in early 80s, I remember there was very little cultural input from the outside world, but we would have movies and TV series imported from like socialist countries like former Yugoslavia, because Yugoslavia back then was still on good terms with China, but China, Sino-Soviet split was still going on, so we wouldn't have any Soviet movies. But in the mid 80s, I start seeing like Soviet movies showing on like War and Peace, and then like the Soviet movies from 80s and 70s starts showing up on state television. So that's when it was like, oh, maybe the Sino-Soviet split is over. So that did happen in 1989 when Gorbachev finally visited Beijing, and that's right in the middle of the Tiananmen Square protest, and that's also a lot of the foreign tourists were actually in Beijing, not tourists, sorry, journalists were actually in Beijing to cover the historical summit between Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping. It just so happened when they came to town, they say, oh, holy crap, there's like a 1 million man protest in the middle of the Tiananmen Square. Like, they were supposed to receive Gorbachev in the Tiananmen Square, but they couldn't because there was 1 million students sitting in there. So they had to like have his reception at the Beijing airport. And so that's why there was a lot of media coverage. Around that time, I was like 12 or 13. I was just like kind of old enough to know kind of what's going on. And I just remember I was like kind of jealous of the university students, because because my dad was a lecturer at the Chongqing University. So we live on the university campus at the university provided housing. So I kind of grew up around those college students, and I was like, damn, they don't have to go to school and they just go protest? Shit, man, I want that. So, because I went to junior high, we still had to go to school. So one day I said, I think there was a time when the Chinese government also like, they went back and forth on whether to recognize the student movement as patriotic. There was a time when the one faction of the government kind of won out temporarily. They say, oh, the student movement is patriotic, but you guys should go back to school. But I used the opportunity to write something in our school, because my real goal is to get us out of class. I don't want to go to school. And I just say, yeah, see, the government said the student movement is patriotic. We should go out in the street and to support them. And at that time, like everybody in my class, like they hailed me as a hero. It felt pretty good. But like no, our teacher was pretty hard ass. She wouldn't let us out. But after, I remember going, we lived in Chongqing, but the main focus of the protest, of course, is in Beijing. But there was protests all over China, in different part of China. So I would go to the protest after school, because everybody went. Like our teachers, went to protest, and it's pretty wild. It was like it's a mass movement, because you have all these people on the streets, kind of festive. So in 1982, the Chongqing University authorities, they decided to rent out a lot of these old underground shelters to like a lot of migrant workers who were moving into the city from the countryside, and they're using them to raise mushrooms, right? Very entrepreneurial. And in one of the caves, they discover some kind of old experiment, for I guess dating from Cultural Revolution, and some like migrant worker took out like some kind of device, but what they didn't know, it was radioactive. It was back then when they took out a radioactive device, but the migrant worker didn't know about it. So he thought, oh, okay, I can sell this for scrap. And later he became sick, and then the news spread like wildfire on campus. So a lot of students were pissed about this incident. So I remember, like it was at night, and all the students rushed out their door, and they were beating on anything, like their pants and pots, and they put out slogans like 还我青春, like return to me my life, my youth, like this is so. But it was a very festive atmosphere. It's like that's my experience with student protests. I just thought, okay, yeah, these college students, they just want an excuse for not going to school, and so we didn't think anything was different developing in 1980, in the late 80s and toward 1989. But anyways, there was a wave of student protests in 1986, 87, and Hu Yaobang became the fall guy, because at that time, at the top of the leadership, Deng Xiaoping was only like the first among equal. He's not like the dictator. So the more conservative faction of the party, they wanted to kind of put a stop to they thought the reform was going too fast. China was like turning away from being socialist. And so in the end, Hu Yaobang became the fall guy. He's the one that was sacrificed, fall on the sword. So he was removed from his position, but he remained deeply popular. And in 1989, Hu Yaobang died. And during his funeral, the students first they came to Tiananmen Square to mourn the passing away of a very popular leader. And then they turned out became a protest for kind of the unfair treatment Hu Yaobang received for taking the fall. And then it became about official corruption, high inflation, and so this started in April 1989, and it went on all the way till June. So period for 2 months, the students occupied the Tiananmen Square, the center of Beijing, more than 1 million people. The city was kind of paralyzed. It was joined by, like I mentioned, by school teachers, nurses, police, people from all walks of life. The protest spread all over China in different cities. I think this triggered a lot of fear in the Chinese top leadership, because it's most of the Chinese leadership experienced Cultural Revolution, and Cultural Revolution is a mass movement. When Mao kind of mobilized all the young students in particular to turn them against his own political opponents in the party, and like because Cultural Revolution is another whole rabbit hole. But basically, Mao at that time he he felt like the Communist Party was betraying its ideal, it's turning into a bourgeois party. Deng Xiaoping back then was casted as a capitalist rotor for like trying to return China back to capitalism. So Mao had Deng Xiaoping removed, but to remove Deng Xiaoping and his and Deng Xiaoping's peers, Mao kind of came out of semi-retirement. He mobilized the masses and mobilized the students to kind of smash down the party bureaucracy at that time. So a lot of the party elders in 1989, they kind of freaked out by the mass protests, because it reminded me of them of the Cultural Revolution, when a lot of them and their family members were struggled in struggle sessions and all that. But there was a split in the top party, in top Politburo. There was an even split. Half of the Politburo want to crack down, the half of the Politburo say, okay, maybe we should make some compromise with the students. So there was because of deadlock, the protest went on for 2 months in the center of Beijing. That's why even when Gorbachev flew in, they couldn't find a space for him to hold the reception in Tiananmen Square. They had to do it at the Beijing airport. And then in the end, the conservative faction won out, because they went to appeal directly to Deng Xiaoping, who was already kind of semi-retirement. And then Deng Xiaoping approved to clear the square. So they sent in the People's Liberation Army in to Beijing, but the army was blocked by the citizens from entering the city limit. By the way, at that time, everything was broadcasted on the state television. I think maybe part of it is because of the divide at the top of the leadership. So everything even though I didn't live in Beijing, I live in Chongqing, which is in the southwest part of China. Every day, people will glue to their television set to watch what's going on in Beijing. We even saw the army being stopped on the outskirts of Beijing, and the citizens blocking the army trucks and all that. What happened was in the morning of June 4th. That's one day the television stopped, signal stopped for like a whole day, and that's when we thought, oh shit, what's going on? Something. And when the television went back on in late that evening, they said there was a counter-revolutionary riot that happened in Beijing. So the army had to take measures to put down the counter-revolutionary riot. And later they showed a lot of footages. So this is another thing people today don't realize. They actually show the footage of Tank Man on Chinese state television, broadcasted nationwide. And because they show the entire footage of the Tank Man, because the Tank Man was blocking this column of tanks coming out of Tiananmen Square. So the tank is trying to go around him, but he wouldn't let the tank pass. And he even climbed onto the tank for a couple of minutes and had a conversation with the tank commanders, and people can look it up. You can find that on YouTube. There's a clip of the entire footage, and it was shot by foreign journalists on top of their hotel balcony. Most of the people saw on in CNN, they only saw the cut off part, the part that the guy was trying to block the tank movement. But the entire footage will show that. He went up on the tank, had a conversation with the tank commander. He came back down. The tank tried to go around him again, and he will block the tank. Yeah. And then there will be a group of. Then there was a group of people on bicycles who rushed by and took him away. And that's the end of it. That's like the entire. He was not killed. He was not flattened.
Okay. I think that's probably what that picture's trying to depict there.
Yes.
This is what everybody knows of Tiananmen Square, and the Tank Man is just that picture in particular of the guy sitting in front of the tank. And I think that the idea is supposed to be, the Chinese government had crushed this protester and he was fighting for freedom or something like that. But it seems like, it didn't quite go that way by what you're saying, that it was kind of like a friendly thing, actually.
Well, the framing in the Chinese state television at then is like, oh, look at this clown trying to stop our tanks, and our tank commander was being reasonable, trying, doing the maximum, show extreme or extraordinary restraint. Right? That's how the position of the Chinese state. But now we know there was a bloodshed. There was shooting, but it didn't happen on the Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square is where the majority of the students camped out. So there were shooting on the way to the Tiananmen Square, particularly in a place called Muxidi. So this is where it gets kind of hazy, because the army claimed that there were snipers from the roof on the apartment buildings that was shooting at the army that was advancing into the city. And they return fire. So this, is verified. There's an excellent documentary called The Gate of Heavenly Peace by an American documentary filmmaker. People can look it up. It's on YouTube. It's actually one of the better Tiananmen documentary produced by Americans. And there was so what happened was the army shot back at those buildings. So some people were killed in the buildings, in their homes, because by the stray bullets, and then there was this apparently enraged the crowd. So a lot of crowds at that time, they built barricades to block the army columns. A lot of the Beijing public buses were piled up on the streets, lit on fire to block the column of tanks, and some they were actually able to stop two tanks, a couple of tanks and armored personnel carrier. They set the tanks on fire with Molotov cocktail. Oh. And when the soldiers got out, they were lynched, and their body were hanged from the bridge. And we were shown those graphic footages when I was in. So when we went back to school in 1989. So the government produced a documentary about the Tiananmen Square. So it's a required showing, so everybody show. So that it was kind of traumatizing for me to see like the burned bodies of soldiers with like their intestines coming out and their body is completely charcoaled and so this is the government side of the story. They say, oh, this is a counter-revolutionary riot, and then the army trying to restore order. But of course, it's a different version presented on CNN. Right. But anyway, like there was a lot of chaos and there was bloodshed. There was a group called the Tiananmen Mothers, who the people who lost their children. For like 10, 20 years, they were going around verifying information like network to find out the names of the people who died, of the protesters. So they came up about 200 names. So I think that's probably around the number of the figure of people who were killed. But by the time the army reached the center of the Tiananmen Square, the protest leaders, they went to negotiate with the army commander, and they came up to they came up to a settlement where the protest leader agreed they would take the students away to leave the square. So that process was largely peaceful, except one freak accident when an armored personnel carrier, for some reason, lost control and ran into a crowd of people who were leaving the square, and like 11 people were killed. And that was the number of people who were killed on the Tiananmen Square, 11 people. And I highly recommend The Gate of Heavenly Peace documentary. I think that's a most reasonable documentary on the Tiananmen Square protest by an American filmmaker. Some of the protest leaders didn't come out very good. For example, Tsai Ing, she was caught on film saying like, our goal is to create bloodshed because only with blood we can wake up the Chinese people's consciousness. So we cannot leave the Tiananmen Square. That was one of the biggest conflict among the students because they were debating before the army came in whether they should leave the square or stay. And Tsai Ing was one of the hardliners. She said, we have to stay. But on camera, she was talking to American film crew, and she said, I cannot tell them that our goal is to create bloodshed, to force the government to open fire, so let the bloodshed wake up the consciousness of the Chinese people. And in the end, he was asked by the American film crews, like, would you stay in the Tiananmen Square? She said, no. He said, I'm too important. I feel like my life is not.
最近我一直感觉到特别悲哀，而且同学的那个，就他本身的民主素质相当的差，而且说句实在话，在我倡议和发起决心的一天，我心里就很明白，不会有任何成果的。我早就知道，有些人，有一些历史注定是失败的。我一直清楚这一点，但是我一直在努力，在给大家一个坚定的形象。我们在争取胜利，但我心里很明白，我就是越看越悲哀。大概4月27号的时候，我就开始感觉到了。但是我现在也想说的是，我一直不愿意说，因为中国人不能骂中国人，但是我不得不说，就是有时候我想中国人，我不知道为你奋斗，我不知道你现实。但是我一想到这次运动的确还有很多很多的正直的、有良心的学生、工人、市民，有知识阶的人，同学们会问我们下一步干什么，我们达到什么要求。我心里觉得很悲哀。我没有办法告诉他们，其实我们期待的就是流血，就是让政府最后无奈之际的时候，他用屠刀来对着他的公益。我想也只有广场血流成河的时候，全中国的人才能真正的擦亮眼睛，他们真正才能团结起来。
Yeah, she said that. And Tsai Ing was ferried out by the CIA, carry out operation called the Yellowbird. Yellowbird. Anyway, so there was a Yellowbird operation carried out by CIA to ferry out the major protest leaders out through Hong Kong to the United States. And Tsai Ing went to American University on scholarship, and he worked for hedge funds, investment on Wall Street, and she's a typical American success story, and she became a born again Christian and all that. So she's very, very, very much assimilated, and so that's the kind of the broad stroke of the Tiananmen Square protest. But at that time, it was the crackdown was deeply unpopular among the Chinese people, and I remember the mood right after Tiananmen Square, and that's why that led to kind of and also the Chinese economy kind of ground into a halt. Because at the time there was Western sanctions applied to China in the immediate aftermath of the Tiananmen Square. I remember that summer the oranges became super cheap because previously all the best fruits, local produce, all exported abroad for hard currency. But because of sanctions, suddenly it was like, oh, the oranges are so cheap this year, and we could eat as much oranges as we want. And so China went on a major diplomatic offensive. So before 1990, China didn't recognize Israel. China didn't have a relationship with South Korea. It didn't have a relationship with Indonesia, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, South Africa. Okay, now after 1990, they still didn't establish a relationship with apartheid South Africa, but they recognized Israel in 1992, they recognized South Korea in 1990, they normalized ties with Singapore and Indonesia in 1990. And one of the deals they made with the Chinese people is that, okay, you can do whatever you want as long as you don't challenge the government. And I remember in United States, like the Chinese Student Association, was seen as kind of arms of the government. So they're also not very popular with the Chinese exchange students. So they will do things like try to lure the Chinese students back into the fold by offering like services. They will hold free movie nights. They will show Chinese movie. They'll provide food and snacks, and then like I know my parents and their my parents' colleagues. They were like, okay, yeah, we don't like the government, but it's free food and free movies, so we'll go. And then they will do things like set up dating service for the Chinese students and try to like help them like write a resume, find a job. So eventually that strategy worked, because I remember in 1990 they were deeply unpopular, but the perception started to change. And interestingly, because I lived in the United States for 30 years, I actually got to know a lot of the former student protesters who now live in the United States, live and work in the United States. Majority of them, their view on the protests nowadays probably will shock most Americans. Their view now is that the protests needed to end.
One of our friend had like the normie view of Tiananmen Square, where they thought that it was, the government being oppressive towards the people. But though he said, oh, no, actually, it was like the people that kind of needed to be quelled, if you will. I'm not saying that they should have been slaughtered, but let me phrase it a different way. So sure,
most of the former protesters, now they have come to the view that the protests need to end, that the China need to return to normalcy. They didn't like the way it ended, that it ended bloodshed, but they're saying you should end. And the one biggest reason that helped them to achieve their conclusion is the collapse of Soviet Union, to see what happened to Russia and the former Soviet blocs, and to witness kind of the economic takeoff of China in 1990. Because when I came to the United States in 1990, there weren't that many made in China goods. I remember when we went Christmas shopping with my parents, we saw a teddy bear that was made in China. It was like a novelty. It was like, oh, wow, made in China. So my parents bought it for me, even though I was like 13 already. And they bought a made in China teddy bear. But like few years after that, it's like made in China everywhere on the shelves. And that's a big transformation, because China suffered economically after 1989 crackdown, because the party conservative faction that kind of won and that advocated for the crackdown, they were in charge. They kind of wanted to roll back the pace of reform. They want China to return back to the true path of socialism. But Deng Xiaoping didn't like that. That wasn't his plan. So in 1992, even though Deng Xiaoping is officially completely retired, like the only official title he had back then was like the president of All China Bridge Club, like the card game Bridge Club. But he still have a lot of clout. So he did a so-called Southern tour. He went to the special economic zone of Shenzhen, which is right opposite of Hong Kong. Shenzhen used to be a fishing village in 1970s when I was born. And they decided at that time, when China first decided to open and reform, they say, okay, this is an experiment. We don't know how it's going to go. So we're going to designate a certain special economic zones where they will introduce market reforms. If it doesn't go well, we'll just shut it down. It's fine. But if it goes well, we can, adopt it and maybe spread it elsewhere. So they actually built walls. So first of all, there's walls between mainland China and Hong Kong, but they also built walls around Shenzhen to like quarantine it off around from the rest of the China. And then in Shenzhen, they allow a more kind of freewheeling, allow the market to take over. And that's when they invited a lot of the investors from Hong Kong, from Taiwan to come and set up factories. And so Deng Xiaoping traveled to Shenzhen in 1992, and he said, everything looks good to me. I don't see why, there's no reason why every other Chinese city could be like this. So after Deng Xiaoping said that was kind of the 180, that kind of opened up the floodgate for the Chinese economic liberalization. Basically, the economic reform was no longer just limited to like this small coastal cities. It was kind of promoted everywhere. Of course, there was a lot of pain. There's a lot of economic transition, especially in 1997, when there was a mass privatization effort. So that's when the Chinese government decided, we don't need to be in charge of all aspects of the economy. We just need to control the pillar industries like oil and gas industry, the finance, the defense industry, and the rest, all the smaller, medium enterprises, they can all go private. And this mass privatization drastically changed the Chinese economy. Like I said before, it's a lot easier to keep tabs on you when everybody works in the state-owned industry. But after that, you can go have your own business, own your own business. So a lot of my parents' generation who came to United States in 1980s, many of them stayed in U.S., got their green card, got their U.S. citizenship, worked in the corporate world in U.S. for like 10, 20 years. Around 2000, many of my dad's former classmates went back to China because in U.S. they have hit a glass ceiling in the corporate world because maybe their language skills or I don't know, interpersonal skill, I don't know, whatever. Because they hit a certain corporate ceiling, glass ceiling that could rise no longer. But if they go back to China, they can be CEOs, they can be founder of companies, can be VIPs, and the sky is the limit. So that's when my dad, he didn't go back because he was already pretty old when he came to when he came to US as an exchange student, he was already in his mid 40s. So he felt like, okay, I'm pretty comfortable working for GM, and I don't need to, I just work until I get my pension. But most of his more ambitious classmates all went back to China. And this is also another reason why a lot of the former student protesters changed their minds about the protest, because they saw what happened. They saw the collapse in total social economic collapse in post-Soviet Russia, and they saw the economic takeoff in China, and they came to the realization, you know what? I didn't like what Deng Xiaoping did, but he was right. He was right to end the protest.